Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
It was just February that we were talking about perhaps both Democrats and Republicans going to their summer national conventions without a clear presidential candidate. And now it's the first week of May, and we're talking about who are going to be the vice presidential candidates. Indiana and Ohio this week have jumped on the Mike Dukakis bandwagon. Vice President George Bush came into this unsuper Tuesday having already chased off his opponents. Indiana now has a gubernatorial race and perhaps a real race at that for a change. Today on Public Affairs Roundtable, we'll talk about this week's primaries in Indiana and Ohio, what lies ahead for the nation with the presidential race, and Indiana with several races, Congress, the legislature, the governor. Our guest today, Ken McKenzie, who is Director of Public Affairs for Ball Corporation, Ray Sheely, Professor of Political Science at Ball State University, and John Rouse, our Executive Producer and a member of the Political Science faculty here at Ball State. It was a great story we had lined up, John. A lot of excitement coming up this summer in these two conventions. But a funny thing happened on the way to the convention, I guess.
Well, it's going to be a fantastic political year still yet. The fact that we have the candidates that we have, for example, we have Jesse Jackson, who is a representative of black Americans. His heritage is one of slavery. Here's a man who's come up from slavery in a sense. So he represents a completely nearly enfranchised group of Americans who really haven't participated in the system in this kind of way previously. Secondly, we have Dukakis, who is also a representative of ethnic America, Greek Americans, so in a sense also representing a flavor of America that's been very different previously as well. And finally, then we have George Bush, Episcopalian, in a sense a Tory of sorts, who represents the establishment. So we have the establishment, we have a newly enfranchised group of Americans, black Americans, and then we have the ethnic Americans who came from Southern Europe. I mean, this is America. And really, as these people compete, what we have here is something we've talked about previously on this program. They're competing for the marketplace of ideas. So they are saying they are raising new agenda for the new president to decide upon in January of next year. So although in a sense the presidential races have been decided for all practical purposes, still we have a very exciting political year coming.
That's a great script. Maybe we'll get a TV miniseries by fall, huh? Ray Sheely, did Jesse Jackson wake up the Democratic Party, wake up America? Did he scare him to death? It was a good story while it lasted.
Well, I think Jesse Jackson represented, I think it certainly was dramatic, as John said, but I think it was also somewhat natural. When national policy in the late 50s and early 60s directly addressed the question of black participation through things such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964, where we made a federal effort to register blacks in America. I think now, more than 20 years later, we're seeing the natural evolution of that, where you have a realistic candidate who's black emerging at the presidential level. In that sense, I'm not so sure it's all that unusual. I think it's part of the evolutionary trend. But let me put a little reverse on this as well. Also, what we're seeing, I think, through these primaries is, whereas Jesse Jackson has made a very credible showing and I think run a very effective campaign, quite frankly, there's a lot of racism in America, and you can see it in the Democratic primary electorate. The vote split along racial lines very clearly. It's whites voting for white candidates, with Dukakis now being the last white candidate, if you will, out of that field. He's getting 90% of the white vote. Jesse Jackson's getting 95, 96% of the black vote. There's still a lot of racial polarization in America. And perhaps the next step in this evolution is going to have to be overcoming that. But it's certainly evident in the voting returns.
Is Jesse Jackson then going to deliver? Has he awakened the black population? Has he coagulated? Has he organized it, and will he deliver it to Democrats and perhaps help them win for a change in November?
Well, in my thinking, blacks are going to vote Democrat this November, regardless of where Jesse Jackson is. If Jesse Jackson decides to take a walk out of the convention, or is vice presidential nominee, or is promised a cabinet position, or whatever Reverend Jackson does, the blacks are going to stay in the Democratic camp this fall.
If they vote. Is there a reason to vote if Jesse Jackson is not part of the platform or part of the ticket?
Okay, on a mass level, as you look at black voting across this country, there's always been a question of black turnout. And I don't think that Jesse Jackson is going to change that one iota this fall. Obviously, the Democrat candidates, if it's Dukakis for president, would want more blacks than ever to vote, certainly, and I think that that's potentially there this fall because of Jackson's candidacy. But Jackson is not going to, by his own actions, depress black voter turnout this fall.
Into the Reagan era, Ken, awfully big shoes for George Bush to fill. Can he be another Ronald Reagan, or do we want him to be?
Well, I don't think he can be another Ronald Reagan. I don't think we would want him to be. If you're talking about President Reagan with all his qualities, if you mean in terms of his conservative political philosophy, I think George Bush could be to some extent. He hasn't shown the inclination to be as consistently conservative as President Reagan has been, but I think he'll follow that tradition to a large extent.
How important is it now that we get a good, strong Republican presidential or vice presidential candidate?
Well, I think it's always important. It's important to the Democrats as well to have a strong ticket, and someone that perhaps could balance the ticket. I know that most people, political analysts, when they look at this sort of thing, they look at regional things and so on. I guess I would look more at someone who, regardless of whether they're from a large state or small state and so on, is most qualified to be president, if necessary.
A couple points. I see Ray's point in terms of this being a very racial society, even a racist society. But Ray, I think that many Democrats are concerned about Jesse Jackson's whiteness as opposed to his blackness. And the whiteness means that he has nothing on his record in terms of service. So we don't know what Jesse Jackson, the unknown, would do. So if you look beyond his name, and then if you look in terms of what he's done in public service, he's never really done anything. Even his organization, PUSH, has a spotty record in terms of implementation. Now, in terms of the Republican concern, it seems to me, Ken, that George Bush is more like Richard Nixon and a traditional kind of presidential Republican than he is like the populist Reagan, and that, in a sense, presents a problem.
Why?
Well, because Nixon tended to polarize things, and he was more of a polarizing figure than Reagan has been. And so Reagan's strength is that he was able to reach over and get Democrats. And so it seems to me the challenge for Bush is to be able to Bush is more of a party Republican, whereas Reagan, being the outsider in a sense, was able to reach not only to a broad base of Republicans, but he also reached to Democrats who would, like the Sam Nunn kind of Democrat, the Albert Gore kind of Democrat. So it seems to me the challenge for Vice President Bush is to be able to reach over and become more of a Reagan Democrat, a Reagan Republican, instead of being more like a Nixon Republican.
Yeah, I think I see what you mean, John, and I would agree in the sense that what I'd like to see George Bush do more of is take hardline, consistent policy positions and say, here's the direction that I want to take our nation during the next 4 years. If it's the same direction as Reagan did, then say that, but articulate exactly what he's going to do. And so far, he hasn't done that to a large extent. And I think as he does, and I'm confident that he will in the fall, I think a lot of people will support that, whether they would tend to vote Democrat or Republican and so on.
So in a sense, you're saying that he really doesn't have a vision. I see Bush as being a kind of a structural Republican. In other words, he goes along with the party. He's been loyal to the party. When he's been called on to serve in positions, he says, I'll be glad to do it. He was CIA director. He was in China. He was at the UN. He's been vice president. He's been several other things. So he's a loyalist Republican. As a Republican said to me some time ago, we're not loyal to the extreme, we are extremely loyal. So it seems that Mr. Bush has been able to bring Republicans in terms of his not being loyal to the extreme, but being extremely loyal.
Well, I think in a sense, I agree with you, but I think that Republicans aren't going to go with Bush just because he's a Republican. I think what really galvanizes support in a candidate is when he articulates positions like Reagan did. I mean, then there was real solid support in the Republican Party. I think that George Bush's support now in the Republican Party is fairly broad, but not real deep. He's got to get a little more intensity to his message. And I think as he does that, then he can branch out and be a stronger candidate. Right now, I'm not sure that the Republicans are as excited about George Bush as they ought to be.
Well, that might be said of Dukakis' support as well. I mean,
Yes.
what you're talking about is, yes, you have some broad support among loyal Republicans, and Dukakis has some broad support among Democrats, but indeed it's that independent vote, the people who might vote Republican mostly, or might vote Democratic, but tend to be rather independent Americans. So basically that's who Dukakis and Bush are going to be fighting over come November.
Exactly.
Okay, so how do you get that vote?
Well, I would say, following up with Ken, though, I don't think we're going to see either Dukakis or Bush articulating a whole set of issues between now and August. All that will happen after August,
Well,
however.
when I said the fall, I meant...
That's right.
Yeah.
Because right now, they're not going to make anybody unhappy with themselves. They're going to talk about their accomplishments and their past records, etc. But I think this is going to be a very hotly contested campaign in the fall at the presidential level, and we're going to see a lot of issue articulation at that time. And I would think right now, we don't know what the conventions will bring about, obviously, but I should think that it's going to be a very close election, and those independents are the ones that are going to make the difference.
Larry, a couple of things, thinking. The fundamentalist Republican right. In a sense, they might be better off with Dukakis in the White House because they'd have a clear something to shoot at. With a Bush in the White House, they still will not get everything they want, and so they're going to be disgruntled. So in a sense, they could have 4 years of really making their pitch at this ethnic Greek American with all these different kinds of values, and so in a sense, they would have a more clear shot. With the Democrats, however, they have a little bit more motivation. They haven't been in the White House for the last 8 years. You take people like Lee Hamilton, who's been rumored to be a Secretary of State under Dukakis, or if you take a guy like Sam Nunn. I mean, even though he's a Henry Jackson kind of Democrat, he hasn't really had his hands on power, and as he's seen it, sitting there on Capitol Hill, he's seen the bureaucracy in the Pentagon, he thinks making some mistakes here and there, so he might like to have a shot at that as being Secretary of Defense. So the Democrats haven't been in power, and they may be more hungry than some Republicans might be.
Well, John, that makes some sense, but it's also some real sinister logic there that, for example, on you say the fundamental right wing, I don't think that people actually make voting decisions and move groups for sinister motives like, let's throw this race away so that we've got a clear shot next time. People don't really behave that way. We might talk about that in the back rooms, smoke-filled rooms, I guess, of political circles, but people don't behave that way.
Doesn't happen that way. Okay. Sounds more like a political scientist, maybe.
We're not talking about any third parties at this point. In fact, do Dukakis and Bush meet generally the needs of the American two political parties in America, that there are no real splinters that could develop, that would develop, that you don't have a John Anderson or even a Jesse Jackson talking about his own party? Are Bush and Dukakis good enough of a menu for the American people come November?
I think that, of course, when third parties do arise and obtain anywhere from 5 to 15% of the national vote, what it demonstrates is what we call in political science electoral volatility, just a whole lot of instability out here in the voting electorate. And through the 70s and into the 1980 race with John Anderson, we had third parties that were gathering that kind of support, starting with George Wallace's 1968 effort. So consequently, what's happened now in the 80s is we haven't had a significant challenge in 1984. It appears we're not in 88. I think the party system, our two-party system, might be settling in and solidifying a bit, which I think is healthy. It takes a two-party system to build a majority, and in that sense, third parties really show that there's a lot of voter unrest and instability going on in the public's mind. So in that sense, I think it's healthy for a two-party system that we don't see any evidence of a third party.
Question marks, of course, what's going to come out in terms of platform for the conventions and certainly the vice presidential candidates. Any names you want to toss out? May we resurrect Dick Lugar's name on the Republican ticket, Ken McKenzie?
You know, I was just thinking about that a little while ago when someone mentioned, I guess you brought up earlier, Larry, about vice president candidates. People have been talking about for Dukakis on the Democratic side and how he might, was it Sam Nunn? And then have Sam Nunn be Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense. I would think that the Republicans ought to consider Dick Lugar and maybe have him be Secretary of State. He did just a fantastic job when he was Chairman of Foreign Relations for a couple of years. And you know, that's the sort of thing that I think would really strengthen the ticket. Now, hopefully the public would understand what a big benefit that would be. Certainly we here in Indiana, I happen to know Senator Lugar and have observed him enough that I think it'd be a tremendous strength to the ticket.
He would provide at least some geographical balance as well. Do we need we need a northern, midwestern, or western candidate? Is George Bush from Texas or is he from
Connecticut?
Connecticut, which Democrats have the same situation.
Depends on where he's campaigning, I think.
Obviously, Bill Bradley's not going to be the vice presidential candidate now. That Mike Dukakis is going to be the presidential candidate. You won't pull two of them from the East Coast. So, are we talking about Lee Hamilton even perhaps for vice president?
Well, that's the first I've heard about that.
We'll start trends here. We're not bashful.
I think he would perhaps do better, as I said a few minutes ago, as Secretary of State. I don't know who would really want to be vice president. Let me ask Ken this question: the Republicans have always utilized California very well because they've carried California in past elections, and they've oftentimes have had someone from California on the ballot. The governor of California, if I can pronounce his name, Duchmagian or something.
Duchmagian.
Something close to that. How likely do you think he may be on the Republican ballot?
Well, he's mentioned very prominently as one of the potential vice presidential candidates. I think the big drawback there is that they would pretty much give up the seat, the governorship, to a Democrat. The Republican Party would. And there's some reluctance, obviously, to do that. On the other hand, I think if Duchmagian was considered really the best candidate, they would nominate him.
Let me bring up one other point here, going back to Dick Lugar for a moment. Won't George Bush carry Indiana without Dick Lugar on the ticket, Ken, or wouldn't you think?
Well, yes. I mean, if George Bush doesn't carry Indiana, I don't think he's going to become president, right? I mean, given the history of presidential voting in the last, 4 or 5 times, I think, the Republican nominee has carried Indiana. So he would not have to have Dick Lugar on the ticket to do that. That's true. I'm thinking about, the next 4 years when George Bush is in there and having someone like Dick Lugar as the vice president, and maybe at the same time in a job like Secretary of State, or use him in some kind of a foreign relations capacity, I think would be tremendous.
While we're in Indiana, why don't we talk about the governor's race a minute? We have a whole generation of Hoosiers who've never known a Democratic governor. Indiana's not elected a Democratic governor since
Going
64.
back to what John Rouse says, the Democrats must really be hungry then if they've been out of power that long.
One would think
they are hungry.
They would have starved by now, but
I mean, they're offering a 32-year-old.
But a guy with a pretty good name. Democrats pretty confident about Evan Bayh's chances, you think?
They have to be. They have to be. The polls, every poll we've seen, indicates, or all of the numbers indicate, that Evan Bayh's sitting almost at 50% right now in the horse race question between Mutz and Bayh. When a person gets that high, that early, it's real hard to catch. If you're the challenger, in this case it'd be Mutz, even though he's the incumbent lieutenant governor. I think we're going to see probably the most hotly contested governor's race, at least in my lifetime, in Indiana. And in that sense, I think that's going to be good for this state. Once again, back to the notion of a strong two-party system, the Democrat Party has not waged viable campaigns at the state level for 20 years or more. And in that sense, now there's going to be a clearly articulated difference between the parties, I think, at the governor's level. And I think that's healthy for our two-party system.
Yeah, if I could ask, the point I made at the first of the show, we talk about this phrase, the marketplace of ideas, and maybe that's kind of an idealistic kind of a way of looking at it. But do you really think that Indiana's going to benefit in terms of bringing out new ideas if we have competition between Bayh and Mutz?
I think so. Depends on what you mean by new ideas. If you're talking about philosophically, I think that'll be defined as the campaign goes along. But in terms of the two candidates, I mean, John Mutz is obviously going to run on his experience, not only as lieutenant governor for 8 years, but in the state senate, on the Ways and Means or Finance Committee, and his knowledge of state government, as opposed to Evan Bayh from the Republican side saying, well, here we've got somebody 32 years old, he's been in office a year and a half, and contrast the experience. Evan Bayh, I think, is obviously going to run on talking about economy and government, which he's already been talking about, and I'm sure articulating more than that as the race goes along.
Yeah, I guess what I'm referring to is I'm just trying to relate political competition to economic betterment. And is it the case that if we do have political competition for races, that will indeed mean that we will have a better society, a more just society, but yet a more productive society? And it's a question that political scientists and economists have talked about for the last 200 years.
Well, let me just jump in here. Sure, all the studies we do about political competition in the states, a strong two-party system, hotly contested, where races are determined between 45 and 55% of the vote, on virtually any other measure of governmental performance, the competitive two-party states come out better than one-party states or non-competitive states. So in that sense, policy initiatives, policy innovations happen in competitive states, in the marketplace of ideas. And I think we can see some of that even in Indiana. When you break apart bipartisan agreements, okay, whether it be over something like the license branch, okay, that both parties just kind of always agreed to. Well, finally, when there was a departure by one party and saying this is no longer acceptable, we got change. And the other party said, yeah, they understood that they were going to lose votes on it. So in that sense, I think a strongly competitive two-party system is very good for policy in this marketplace of ideas, and most of our studies show that.
Obviously, John Mutz has a great deal of experience. Evan Bayh, not quite so much. We're going to find Evan Bayh, I think, talking about the future and characterizing John Mutz as talking about his experience, which is the past. John Mutz is going to have to obviously rely on some of his own ideas about the future as well. He's not going to be able to ride the coattails of the Bowen or administrations, and the Republicans are always electing Indiana. He really has, I would think, his job cut out for him to follow that kind of success in the Republican Party.
Well, in terms of, if you mean electoral success, since the Republicans have been in a long time, yeah, I think it makes it more difficult for John Mutz. But in terms of his success, I mean, I really think he's, one of the most qualified people to ever come along to be our governor. I've known him for maybe 15 years now. I've never seen anyone that takes his job more seriously. You could sit down with John Mutz, and he knows the tax code of Indiana backwards and forwards. He knows economics. He's been in business. I mean, he's really a very, very impressive individual in terms of his own knowledge and dedication to the job. Now, he's got to articulate that and convince the voting public of that. And in that sense, I think, yes, he does have his job cut out for him.
There seem to be great qualities for a lieutenant governor. I mean, a guy who has to direct the Department of Commerce, for example, a guy who has to deal with the legislature to some extent.
Oh, but the governor
leadership
does too.
qualities.
The governor presents his program each year to the legislature and has to try and get that through. And, you know, John Mutz has the experience as lieutenant governor and being in the legislature and in the Senate, I think, to really understand that process. Then I think what the public should be deciding is looking at what the candidates are saying. I mean, John Mutz is going to say, here's the direction I want to take the state. Evan Bayh is going to say, here's what I want our state's future to be. And then the people have to make a choice, and they'll try and implement their program, work with the legislature to do that.
Since we've had both of them on this program, what I recall from our interviews was, first of all, John Mutz, to me, in terms of his experience, he probably wouldn't like to be compared to our Congressman Phil Sharp, but Phil Sharp and John Mutz seem to have one thing in common. They really know so much information, they have so much experience that they know, they have forgotten more than most people know. So from that point of view, I would think that John Mutz really has something to sell. However, in talking to Evan Bayh on this program, to me he seemed to have a real sense of presence. So since this is a basketball state and basketball culture, let me make this illustration. You know, the basketball coach that really had all the experience and so forth and so on, and he was there in the job for 15 years, but he never got it done. And then this young, flashy coach came in and was able perhaps to do it. So it seems it's that kind of a situation where a new generation is coming in, or a new generation, meaning the 32-year-old Bayh, is saying, hey, we have something to offer too.
The only thing I don't like about the analogy, John, is that you said, you know, the coach been around a long time and never got the job done. I mean, John Mutz has gotten the job done. His question is, well, does the public want, you know, his experience and the kind of leadership that he would provide, or do they want?
Bad news, guys. Game's over. I hear the buzzer now. Thanks to our panelists, Ray Sheely from Ball State's Political Science Department, Ken McKenzie, Director of Public Affairs at Ball Corporation, and John Rouse, our executive producer, for their commentary today. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for being with us.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana, 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producers are Nancy Carlson, Steve Johnson, and Bill Mosher. This program is a production of University Media Services and the Department of Political Science. Facilities and funding are provided by University Media Services on the campus of Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.